Hello and welcome back to the World Leader Leaderboard, the podcast where we discuss every world leader, rank them, and tell you who's doing best and worst each week. This week, I'm joined by Zach.
Hello.
Nadja.
Hello.
And Ben.
Hello.
And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing world leaders, including Keir Starmer, Vladimir Putin, and Zelensky. So Putin and Zelensky both moving this week. It's an interesting one. Which directions, we'll find out later in the episode. We will, of course, also be discussing your audience suggestion, and we'll be moving them or adding them based on your thoughts in the comments. This is how the World Leader Leaderboard stands right now, and we will be changing it almost immediately as we head into our winners of the week. So Ben, let's start with you.
Yeah.
Who is your winner of the week?
So my winner is Keir Starmer, and I think it's fair enough putting him up this week because the last few months he's had a really tricky job. His polling's been going down. Domestically, he's really struggling, but internationally, he's really sort of making he's doing very well. He had a meeting on Friday with Donald Trump on Thursday, with Trump in the White House, and this was an opportunity for him to really build like a personal relationship. I think Trump is a man that is very much driven by personal relationships, especially when he's dealing with other countries. So forging that was really important. And he really did go to pains to try and butter him up. He brought a letter from the king inviting him to a second state visit, which is something no American president has been offered before. So really, really going in for the sort of flattery approach, I suppose. And by all accounts, it seems that this has gone very, very well. I mean, Trump has been flirting with introducing tariffs to the UK, and there's been tentative suggestions that this is now not going to happen as a result of the meeting. Trump had some very kind words to say about the UK, which is obviously positive on that. Also, I mean, it's bizarre that this is the way that international relations is having to work at the minute. It's bizarre that we're having to try and butter one person up, and that's how the approach between two countries is dictated. But unfortunately, that is the way that things are going. And by all accounts, it seems that Starmer's done a very good job of it.
Interesting. Yeah, Starmer moving into the upper tiers of the board now, which, considering the videos we're making on TLDR UK and the general conversation around Starmer and his polling and stuff like that, is interesting. But I see what you mean. Yeah. Domestically and internationally, it does seem as beginning to be a divide between Starmer's performance, right?
Yeah, and it's strange because you even have sort of right wingers praising his approach on Thursday. It's really quite remarkable, and this is an area that he really does need to do well in. And I think a lot of his sort of the domestic side in the next few years is going to be driven by international elements, especially things to do with tariffs, trade deals, etc. Yeah. So having that close relationship with Trump is important. It was suggested that this was sort of 5-6 months in the making behind the scenes. Yeah. A lot of former Blair advisors actually getting involved with the exact sort of optics of this. He was very careful not to speak to reporters on the plane over in order not to make any errors to try and sort of jeopardize the actual meeting before it happened. So yeah, by all accounts, I think his team seemed very happy with it. The press response seemed to be very good. By all accounts, it seems that he's done a very good job of this on Thursday.
Zach, Nadja, what do you make of Keir Starmer moving up on the board?
Apart from the whole infantilizing Trump, he has done a good job. It's interesting because when he did come into power last July, it did seem like he didn't have any very specifically strong foreign policy stances. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of develops now, especially with the whole relationship with Trump.
The point you made at the very, very start that he's slightly the flattery of Trump. I think obviously it's gone down well in America with Trump, but I think there is an open question about how well it goes down with Labour voters. Yeah. I mean, polling suggests that Trump is very, very unpopular with Labour voters, and to see Starmer sort of buttering up and flattering him and offering him second state visits and all that sort of stuff, presumably that won't go down brilliantly with at least some of his base.
Yeah, it's interesting how the public will respond to that as time goes on, because I think in the short term, it's easy to see that this is just like a functional thing. Get Trump on side. Yeah. We don't want tariffs. We do want Ukraine to be treated better. If Starmer can be a person who convinces him on that, then fine. Allow him to meet the king and have a nice dinner in London or whatever. But you're right. If those objectives aren't achieved, then that approach looks more difficult, right?
I think a lot of the opinion of Starmer is driven by how the press reports on it. And to be fair, I think all factions, all wings of the press have been quite positive about Thursday. I don't disagree that there'll be some hardcore sort of left-wingers in the party that are frustrated by how close he's getting to Trump. But I think most people will realise that, as you say, this is a functional thing rather than an ideological thing. I think that Labour leaders tend to try to get close to American presidents, even if they're not, from the same side or of the same ideology. And I think it's just a continuation of that. I don't think it'll hurt him too much.
I mean, I don't know exactly what kind of talks are going on with Trump and Starmer, but with Trump very explicitly saying, no US peacekeepers in Ukraine. And then recently, a lot of reports going around that Starmer's basically kind of green-lighting the possibility of British deployment in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I think there's probably some kind of deal going on behind the scenes, which made Trump a lot more easier to butter up, I guess. And I don't think that will. I don't think a deployment of British troops would go down very well with Starmer's electorate and young British people in the near future. I don't know.
I think it depends how it's done. I think there's a world in which, as a result of all the negotiations and the role that Starmer takes, Britain is becoming relatively significant in dictating the world order going forwards. And I think that can play more so than previously.
I agree. I just think it's quite an entertainingly grandiose claim. It's giving sort of like images of Emperor Starmer dictating the world order.
I agree that had imperial overtones that I didn't intend it to have. But and I think that goes down quite well. I think it's making us more important on the international stage again. And again, it depends how that's played going forward. But I think that he's setting that up, and then that could be an outcome from this.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree on the world stage point. I mean, the reason you're putting him up is mainly to do with the Trump meeting, which was obviously a massive diplomatic success. Yeah. But then obviously since then, we're recording this on Monday, and that meeting was on what, Thursday? Was it Thursday?
Thursday.
Yeah, and since then, there's obviously been Zelensky came to the UK and very, very well received, and that went down well. Yeah, and then today we have all these sort of the coalition of the willing, as they're being described, basically sort of pro-Ukraine Western leaders meeting in London again. And again, Starmer's receiving massive plaudits for sort of getting everyone together and giving this sense of Western unity in the sort of the days after that slightly chaotic Oval Office meeting between Trump and Zelensky.
He's looking great stood in the middle of those photos. Yeah, he's very good at standing on a staircase in the middle in his suit, looking good.
It's so strange that he's got such a perception in domestically being weak, not able to change events, not being that important, and internationally it's sort of going in the other direction. It's quite a strange dichotomy.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, the board will dictate in future weeks, I suppose, whether those two things align, whether the perception of him domestically begins to change as his international power grows, or if his international power begins to look more just like a man stood on a staircase looking for friends rather than actual power.
Can I say one more thing?
Go for it.
The one last thing is that I think I'm going to agree with Naja that I think that talking about committing troops and increasing defense spending goes down well with most voters. But it's always the easy bit is saying it. Yeah. And then, the classic issue is that when you all of a sudden you say, okay, we're going to have 35,000 troops in Ukraine or however many it's going to be, that all of it, when that actually starts happening, people will get a bit edgy. And the same thing when you actually increase defense spending to 2.5% of GDP, which Starmer committed to in the campaign, but didn't give a date. Precisely because he knows that you actually have to make some sort of fiscal trade-offs to get to that number.
Yeah.
And again, it's very easy to say, we're going to get up to 2.5% GDP and everyone goes, oh, very, very good. But the second you have to either raise taxes or probably cut health spending, for instance, people get a little bit I'm not too sure about that.
That makes sense.
Money's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah. Okay, let's move down the line. Nadia, who is your winner of the week?
My winner of the week is Russian President Vladimir Putin. He's basically just been able to sit back and let events kind of unfold for his own gain. Obviously, there was the whole Oval incident between Zelensky and Trump, and Zelensky being, it really depends who you ask of the optics of that situation, but kind of Zelensky just being battered completely. There wasn't really a winner out of that whole kind of debacle. Really, the only winner between Trump and Zelensky was Putin, you could argue. Basically, as well, the past week we've seen a lot more details coming out about Trump's kind of economic reapproachment towards Ukraine. There was that whole loads of things being talked around the rare earths mineral deal between Trump and Zelensky, but that's kind of not completely fallen through. But you've had Putin kind of coming up and saying, oh, you don't have to make a deal with Zelensky, you can make a deal with me. We'll give you a much better offer. And there was also reports over the weekend or on Friday that one of like Putin's closest allies are having talks with some of Trump's allies and the Trump administration to restart pipeline gas on the Nord Stream pipeline, Nord Stream 2. If that happens, that's another major win for Putin and Russia. Being able to restart gas supplies is something like a year ago. If you said that a year ago in Europe, that would kind of seem like impossible. But now the fact that these talks are restarting again and the possibility of that happening is even a thing now is kind of a bit insane, and just speaks to the fact of how Trump's realignment is really playing into Putin's hands. But that's basically more or less it.
I think it's just the fact that you know that Trump is aligning more with Putin, but to see it so clearly on Friday, I mean, that couldn't have gone better for Putin.
Yeah. And he just had to sit and watch it on
he didn't even
Fox
do
News
anything.
Or, I don't know where it was transmitted, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I obviously agree. I think the caveat to put in is that it all depends on the European response, right? From Ukraine's perspective, in the best possible world, that massive fallout in the Oval Office inspires a sense of European unity, forces the Europeans to step up their support to Ukraine. And then, Ukraine then has an ally and a partner that's providing sufficient support, but is also more reliable than the Americans. And that's the best possible outcome. But I agree. I think Putin would have really enjoyed watching Zelensky and especially Vance fall out. I mean, you sort of saw that afterwards in that Dmitry Peskov, who's the Kremlin spokesperson, was utterly gleeful on Russian state TV, saying, Zelensky got what he deserved and all that sort of shenanigans. And I think this morning he's put out a statement saying it proves that Western unity is fraying. This will be going down very, very well in the Kremlin. And the other thing that Naja mentioned that I think is really, it's just sort of insane, is that how much mileage the Russians have apparently got out of talking up some sort of economic deal with America. This is something that keeps on recurring in Trump administration statements. So I think Vance talked about it a little bit, but Steve Witkoff, who's sort of Trump's special envoy, talked about it after the meeting between US and Russian officials in Saudi Arabia. And Trump has put some posts on Truth Social where he's talking up the sort of massive economic potential of some sort of deal with Russia. And it just, where do you even start? It's just not really true. The most optimistic estimates of sort of American corporate losses in Russia post-sanctions are sort of like $50 billion, which is just nothing in the context of the overall American economy. And it's not like they have complementary economies. Russia mainly produces tanks and oil at the moment, and America has enough tanks and oil, and also more reliable oil from places like Canada. It's just so odd that Trump is so optimistic about this sort of trade-induced prosperity when at the same time you're starting trade wars with your actual trading partners.
Sure.
I don't want it to sound too partisan. I just think it just doesn't. I just don't understand it. I don't understand why he's so interested in the economic deal with the Russians. I just think it falls apart the tiniest bit of inspection.
Yeah, there's a whole the LNG stuff as well.
They're competing.
Trump's saying on one side he's saying, Europe, we want you to buy more of our liquid natural gas. But at the same time, it's but we'll take sanctions off Russia and let them pump gas to you.
And apparently try and restart Nord Stream 2. And also on the rumours that we heard on the Nord Stream 2 stuff, there was a report in the FT that I presume you're mentioning.
Yes.
It was the idea there was that the Americans were going to invest money to sort of restart it somehow. And then American companies would take a fee, skim something off all the gas trade done by Russia and Europe. And it's an offensive idea to European sensibilities, the idea that we'd restart trading gas with Russia willy-nilly because the Americans told us to. Yeah. And not only that, we'd then pay a premium to the Americans because they helped us restart the trade. It's just crazy.
Yeah.
But it's good for Putin, right?
It is good for Putin. Yeah, again, I think the caveat, it
might not make
depends on
sense, but that doesn't, if it's convincing the Trump administration, even if it doesn't make partisan sense, even if it's inconsistent, it's still a win for Putin.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Which moves him up to the middle of the board. And we will come back to this issue, obviously. We've kind of reflected on it quite a lot already. We've had the kind of Starmer-Trump meeting. We've had Putin's reaction to Trump's various kind of shenanigans and the European response to it. There is more of that coming up. We're going to move on for the moment because, as I say, there's more movement on the board happening in relation to this situation later in the down section. So prepare yourself for that. But before we move to that, Zach, who is your winner of the week?
Oh, I haven't even done that. Yeah. Oh, my winner of the week is sort of Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa. I think he's going up just because it is incredible how well he's kept Syria together. But then also a couple of more specific things that I think merit a move up on the board. And the first is something we covered over on TLDR Global, which is there has been some tension between Syria and Israel recently because the Israeli government has started saying that they need to basically create a buffer zone on top of their pre-existing buffer zone in southern Syria to protect Syria's Druze minority. And that happened sort of over last weekend. And then a couple of days ago, there were more comments suggesting that actually the Israelis were considering deploying to what is essentially a suburb of Damascus, a southern suburb of Damascus. And in just the past couple of hours, I think actually on sort of, we're calling this on Monday, I think on Sunday night, Sharar's security forces entered that suburb, which is dominated by the Druze minority. And were just sort of happily welcomed in by the people living there, which suggests that now they have a security presence there, the Israelis probably aren't going to turn up, which is good for Sharar. I mean, he's apparently successfully deterred the Israelis, at least for now. Also, the EU last week finally suspended sanctions on Syria, which is more good news. And at the moment, we are hearing rumours, nothing confirmed yet, of a prospective sort of peace deal between Sharar's HTS, like rebel-led government, which controls obviously most of Syria, especially that sort of western coastline, and the Kurdish groups, the SDF, in the northeast, in that territory that's now known as Rojava. The sort of territories are basically separated by the Euphrates.
Yeah.
And yeah, that would essentially mean the sort of territorial unification of Sharar's Syria.
So that moves Sharar right to the top of the board with Xi and Trump. Obviously, when he first entered the board, it was around the time that he kind of entered the political realm and became
December.
like a known figure. So we've been kind of tracking him throughout the duration of this series. What do you think he's done over the last few months in order to achieve this success? Because I think when he first entered the board, there was some skepticism as to whether he would last. Like, he was obviously the figure that led the movement, but that doesn't necessarily mean kind of long-term success. And I mean, obviously, we're only a few months in, so it's still too soon to fully appraise. But do you think he has particularly done anything successfully to be able to reach the top of our board?
Yeah.
Or is it circumstantial that this is just what's happened with his movement?
No, I think the reverse is true. I think it's actually incredible the circumstances that like he's performed in and that he's succeeded in. I mean, you know, if you'd gone back to December and you'd said a rebel group that controlled a little bit of Idlib has now taken over the whole of Syria and kicked Assad out, you'd be like, that can't last. You know, there's no way. And he has proven a phenomenally adept politician. I mean, we all know this because we all see quite favourable Western coverage of him every couple of days when he does an interview with the Rest is Politics dudes, for instance. He can come here if he wants. But yeah, he's a very savvy politician. I think most recent example of this, by the way, is a sort of diplomatic tour he's just done of all the neighbouring Arab countries. So it's quite impressive that he is building cozy relations with not just Turkey, who obviously HTS's main backer back when they just controlled Idlib, but also the Arab states who've traditionally had quite tense relationships with Turkey. So he's got friends across the region. The only enemy he sort of has at the moment is Israel. And he's kept Syria together by successfully convincing, sort of, you might call Syria's minorities, that they will be represented in a future HTS-led government, but also by successfully sort of transforming HTS from an Islamist organization to a sort of Syrian nationalist organization. This is something we talked about in the videos back in December, but actually for quite a few years now, Sharar has been moving away from sort of like transnational Islamism towards a form of Syrian nationalism, talking about like rebuilding Syria. And he has credibility in that respect now because he's been talking about that for so long. And he has successfully convinced, apparently, most of Syria that he's not trying to sort of squash their minorities or push out into the wider region to create a sort of ISIS-style caliphate. He actually just wants a unified Syrian state. Yeah. And that has gone down really, really well. I think an incredibly savvy politician. I mean, you think of him as a warlord, but he's fundamentally a political animal and he's incredibly good at it.
And he finds himself at the top of the world leaderboard. I'm sure I'll be very flattered by that. And I'm sure he'll take you up on the offer to come to London to the podcast studio.
Keeping all the minorities in Syria is like, it seems like he's doing that really well. And the Druze community as well. Like, I think they're pretty happy with like the new kind of regime and system, whatever. And I think there was something like reported that they object to Israel's advances into Syria, but they're like, no, we're good here. Like, our rights are protected. Something like that.
Yeah, well, no, it's hard to know.
I think
it's hard to know because you get so many like conflicting reports. But basically, the sort of preeminent Druze group, which is called I think Al Suwaida Council, it's named after Suwaida, which is one of the provinces, Druze majority provinces in southern Syria, came out when Israel Katz, who's the sort of like Netanyahu's defense minister, started saying that they needed to create a sort of pacified zone in southern Syria. They came out and said, look, we have anxieties about this new Shara HTS Islamist project in Syria, but fundamentally we want to be part of a unified Syria.
Yeah. Okay, great. So those are our winners of the week. Before we move on to the audience suggestion and the losers of the week, I want to quickly shout out our magazine, Too Long. A special shout out this week, because this week only, as part of a broader push across the entire TLDR network, we're offering a special offer on Too Long, which means you can pick up a copy for less than £5. Before I explain how, a quick explainer as to what this is if you're not familiar. Every 4 months, we make a physical magazine, which goes through some of our best journalism, and it runs through a whole bunch of different topics. It explains all kinds of things that we couldn't fit into videos, or we want to explain in more depth or in different ways. So if you enjoy our content as is and want like a physical version of it that you can keep and you can read and you can collect, then Too Long is the best way to do it, because it truly is some of our best and favorite work. As you can probably see from the front cover of this issue, the latest copy, the one that's coming out in a month's time, the one you would be buying, is our world's most influential people list. It includes profiles and articles and explainers about the 25 most influential people in the world as ranked by the TLDR team and as ranked by you. We haven't yet revealed the list, so you don't know who's going to be in it, but that's part of the fun. You can find out by picking up a copy who made it to the list, what disagreements there were between the team and the audience, and you can find all of that out by picking up a copy. As I say, if you use code SUBSCRIBE now and you subscribe to Too Long, you can get £3 off the price of a copy, which brings down the cost as low as $4.99. So make sure you use that code, subscribe now at checkout, and that only lasts for the next week. So you don't have long, and make sure you subscribe rather than just buying an individual copy. Also, one very last thing, there's two versions. There's a standard edition and a premium edition. And if you go for the premium edition, you also get a bunch of extra stuff. You can find out more on the website. But the main thing I want to shout out is we have just released our rundown of the team's top 25, where they debate and discuss who they think should be on their version of the list. And it's a particularly interesting video. Obviously, everyone who buys the magazine will be able to see who the team's top 25 are. But if you're not a premium purchaser, you won't be able to see the shenanigans and the wrangling that went into it. And trust me, there was some wrangling. We could potentially have a monumental jump on our hands.
Yeah.
Hands up for leapfrogging into sixth.
The most powerful European country, the second biggest economy, the nuclear power that is... The nuclear power!
Yeah.
So if you want to watch that, then make sure to pick up a premium copy to get all of the exclusive stuff. Okay, that is everything. Let's move on to the audience suggestion for who we should be moving this week. Okay, so as always, the audience get to comment who they want to see added to the board or moved on the board, and whoever the top comment is the person selected. This week is a new addition to the board. It's Rwanda's Paul Kagame. So we're going to run down the panel. Each of you can say whether you think he's a winner or a loser this week, a bit of a reason why, and presuming we reach some kind of consensus, that's how they'll move. If we don't, we need to fight it out. But let's start with Zach. Kagame, winner or loser this week?
But I think Kagame has to be a winner. For not very good reasons, but he has to be a winner. The reason he's a winner is essentially because, I mean, not necessarily the past week, but the past few weeks, a group of rebels called the M23, who are, everyone sort of now agrees, are essentially backed by Rwanda, have taken a fair bit of territory in the Democratic Republic of Congo around Lake Kivu. And obviously this has provoked sort of a fair bit of upset in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But the international reaction has been remarkably muted, essentially because a lot of the big international players, especially in the West, including the UK, the US, the EU, quite like Kagame, despite the fact that he is sort of fundamentally a sort of authoritarian dictator with rigged elections where he normally wins like 99.95% of the vote, because Rwanda just is relatively stable. It's a sort of rare point of stability in that bit of Africa. And that means that the DRC have been calling for international sanctions. They just haven't materialized. And not only has Rwanda taken a non-trivial amount of territory, but it's also some pretty mineral rich territory, which has been pretty great for Rwanda's state coffers. Rwanda has turned into a pretty big gold exporter, despite the fact that it doesn't really mine any gold. And that's clearly because it's mining the gold in the Congo, and it's being rerouted out via Rwanda. He has essentially gotten away with a land grab, and the international reaction has been conspicuously muted, and it's probably making pretty good money. So I think you have to put him up.
Najo?
I put him up as well, but I guess I'd add just a caveat here. So for the past 25 years he's been in power, he's kind of transformed Rwanda into what was a country that was completely torn apart by war, genocide, into this stable stabilitocracy, or one of the most stable countries in East Africa. And he's done a pretty good job of portraying himself as a strong leader to the West love him, whatever. He's gotten a lot of investment into Rwanda as well, and all of that stuff has been great for the country. But this whole land grab situation does kind of risk his whole premise and stance on the country for the past 25 years, which has been kind of stability. I guess if things turn south, and this whole land grab situation and the fighting that's going on in Goma kind of goes across the borders or spirals into something a bit out of control and causes some kind of instability in the region, then I think he'll lose a lot of credit. But that's all very speculative, and I'll move him up as well.
He's getting away with it
depending on what's out.
Yeah. Ben?
I'm agreeing with those two.
Okay, fair enough. That's consensus then.
Yeah.
Kagame is added to the board, and he's added in the lightly positive section. And as Naja says, it'll be interesting to track as time goes on, because he's getting away with it now, as the West broadly like him. But that won't necessarily hold. So we'll have to keep an eye on him on the board in future weeks. Speaking of future weeks, feel free to suggest who you think should be added to the board or moved on the board. And also keep an eye on other comments and upvote the ones that you like, because whoever lands at the top by the time we record next time will be the person who's added or moved. So let us know in the comments who you think that should be. Okay, let's move on to our losers of the week. Ben, you can go first. Who is your loser of the week?
So my loser of the week is Zelensky. So there's a sort of inherent contradiction almost in the decision to moving down, because as a result of what happened in the Oval Office on Friday, there was a lot of support that was provided to Zelensky by international figures, and even within Ukraine. I think particularly within Ukraine. So you have opposition leaders, Poroshenko, Zelensky's predecessor, for instance, has made a big point of this not being something that people should attack Zelensky for, and this should be a moment of unity in Ukraine. A lot of Western leaders, a lot of leaders around the world have come out in support of Ukraine. But despite that, I think what happened on Friday demonstrates more than anything else that the relationship between Zelensky and Trump is fracturing. And the relationship between those two is so important, especially in this period where we're trying to negotiate for peace. And I think that's the most significant thing here. The fact that Trump operates so much on personal relationships, the fact that so much of this is determined by what he thinks of other leaders individually in order to come to agreements and deals, is such bad news for Zelensky as a result of what happened on Friday. I think as well, there's debate it's only been a few days since it happened, so no one is entirely clear on why that happened. There's been some suggestions by some within Ukraine that have basically suggested that this could have been deliberate in order to sort of undermine Zelensky, I suppose. The fact that Putin seems that he's unwilling to give concessions could result in Trump not getting a deal as quickly as he'd previously promised.
Yeah.
And this would give him someone to blame for that, essentially. That is an interpretation. But again, that's not guaranteed. And there are other interpretations as to why what happened on Friday. But irrespective of why it happened, the result is that this is just bad news for Zelensky, particularly because of his relationship with Trump now.
Interesting. Before we discuss that too deeply, and in a break from form, I'm going to ask Zach for his loser of the week right away, because there is a link between the two, and I think it makes sense to discuss them side by side. So, Zach, who is your loser of the week?
Well, my loser of the week is Trump. Yeah. And it's in part because of the falling out that you're talking about in the Oval Office. And I think that has done pretty bad damage to America's international reputation and standing, especially its sort of soft power. But actually, the main reason Trump's going down for me, by the way, is the economy. There's been a bit of polling recently suggesting that Trump's approval ratings have fallen slightly. You know, he's sort of like net -10. So 55% disapprove, 45% approve. Not terrible numbers, you know, pretty low by historical standards, but Trump has always had pretty low approval ratings. But what's, I think, a little bit worrying about those is that actually when you dig into the data, a lot of it is driven by independents. So Republicans love Trump at the moment, but independents are turning on him. And a lot of that is because they don't like his economic policies. And there is already quite a lot of evidence to suggest that the Trump economy is looking a little bit shaky. Most of this has to do, we won't get any hard data, like official quarterly data, until next month. But there are a number of surveys on like consumer and business confidence that come out more regularly. And the Atlanta Fed does a sort of live updated GDP projection. And all the consumer confidence surveys are appallingly negative at the moment. Basically, consumers and businesses are both just scared of the sort of unpredictability of Trump's economy. And as a consequence of that, the Atlanta Fed's live estimate of GDP, which if you just look at it on a graph, it just sort of like ticks along, 2.5% year on year, something like that. A bit of fluctuation, but that's like America's growth rate has dropped to -1.5. So according to that metric, America is already in, well, not a recession because that takes 2 quarters, but the economy is already contracting. That would be astonishing if that is borne out in the data next month. That would be like catastrophic. And yeah, another thing, I think you see this a little bit in the fact that the American stock market is looking a little bit shaky at the moment. We've seen some slight declines in the S&P 500. And the last thing I will say is the deficit. Trump's policies that he talked about during the campaign were always going to widen the deficit. They involve more spending and more tax cuts. So it's always going to be more deficit. The budget that the House just passed and that has been endorsed by Trump would, again, massively expand the deficit by another couple of percentage points of GDP every year. And as we detailed in a video over on TLDR Global, DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, is, at least according to their own numbers, failing to trim the deficit by any meaningful amount. And that, so far, Treasury, I don't want to get too much into this, but so far it's looked fine because essentially everything's feeling so precarious that investors are pouring money into treasuries as a safe asset, which means that, the Americans continue borrowing more money. But if you continue to expand the deficit, borrow more and more and more, surely at some point you get to a crisis. And yeah, so that's why Trump is going down. It's in part about the Oval Office, but it's also because the economy is looking a little bit shaky.
Let's leave the economy point for a second because that obviously is separate, but let's discuss the kind of crossover between the two. So the consensus from you two, at least, is that neither side came out of this well, that maybe certain figures on the Republican Party appreciated Trump and Vance attacking Ukraine and attacking Zelensky. And I think generally the international response, as you say, has been people coming out in favor of Ukraine and even people like taking stronger stances than maybe previously in reaction to Trump. But the net result from this, you think, is negative for both of them? Is that an agreed stance, or do you both just think it's losing on your sides?
No, I agree. I think Naja's take at the top is correct in that I think that both Trump and Zelensky lost from that meeting and Putin sort of won.
Yeah. What do we think is going to happen to Zelensky now? We're obviously seeing he's returned to Europe and there's been a bunch of support from European leaders. He's met with Starmer and other European leaders now in the UK. What do we think the European reaction is going to be? Is this a long-term loss? Or, as you say, is there hope for Zelensky that this potentially bounces back and this leads to more European unity and more European support, even if he loses the White House to some extent?
I think Europe is going to try and rally around Zelensky. They're certainly going to try and increase defence spending. We've seen that here in the UK. But I think ultimately you do need Trump, you do need him brokering that peace and sorting out that peace agreement. And unfortunately, as a result of Friday, that has weakened that relationship. I think that's still tricky. I absolutely do think that it's going to push Europe into action. I think we've already started seeing that. But ultimately, I just think that the US is required in a lot of this. And that's why I'm suggesting Zelensky go down.
I think that makes sense. I think Zelensky now is dropping to the lightly negative section. I think given the trajectory of things, I think that feels accurate, right?
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, Ben's take is the consensus take. Most people, including Starmer, think that the US does need to be involved in some capacity. You know, the US needs to provide some sort of security guarantees. I think Starmer's talked about, for instance, air power. You know, we need the Americans to guarantee sort of dominance in air power against the Russians. I personally don't think so. I actually just think that Europe has the fiscal and sort of military capacity to do it by itself. Nadia wrote a video on this not too long ago about whether or not we should actually expect Russia to attack a European country after Ukraine. My instinct is probably no. If the European support for Ukraine is sufficient, I don't think Russia would risk it against another European country. I think, you know, it's just collectively Europe has way more troops, way more money, and way bigger defense budgets. I think it should be able to cope with Russia by itself. But as to what happens to Zelensky next, I think there are two components, right? There's the international moment, which is what you guys are talking about. You know, how does the world react? I think it all depends on how Europe steps up. I mean, Ben, you're right to say that we've seen some signs of Europe stepping up. But again, mostly rhetorical. It's people saying we will increase defense spending to 2.5% of GDP. And again, the question is like, where does that money come from? I think one of the most interesting things to look at is whether or not it ends up being done on an EU basis or more of a sort of like what Starmer's calling Europe Plus, which is sort of, you know, basically the willing members of the EU plus Canada and the UK who've suggested, and maybe Turkey as well, who all suggested they want to support Ukraine. Because if it ends up being done on that basis, I think it becomes a bit piecemeal. You've got lots of national militaries. I think what's more interesting is if the EU ends up leading the effort, in which case you might see deeper coordination at the EU level. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Especially because I think one of the reasons that that basically Europe might be tempted to let the EU lead it is because if it's done at the EU level, the EU can borrow the money, and then we can talk about, you know, where we're going to find the money later. You know, we can pay it all back in a couple of years' time. But the other thing I think is domestically. So that's the international question. I think domestically, it's actually changed the game massively for Zelensky, because the polling before the Oval Office thing did suggest that Zelensky would win another election. Although I think, again, point we made in the video, Trump was always pushing for elections, I think in part because he thought Zelensky didn't have the political space to agree to a peace deal. And he hoped that whoever replaced Zelensky would be easier, would be more malleable. But everyone who was competing with Zelensky in the polls was going to take a harder line. You know, Poroshenko, for instance, who you mentioned, his predecessor, is a far more hawkish Ukrainian nationalist, and Zelensky fell out with Zelensky because Zelensky wanted to escalate against Russia. So I thought that plan was crazy in the first place. But the polling now suggests, there's been one poll out by Survation in the past couple of days, that Zelensky now has a plurality of voters. He would probably win another election. And Ben's right to point out that both Poroshenko and Zelensky, who are sort of like the other two candidates who could realistically win an election, have both rallied behind Zelensky. So I think, in the international response, I think depends basically on whether or not the rhetorical support for Ukraine that we've seen from European leaders actually translates into military support. And then I think the domestic response is more certain. The domestic sort of consequences for Zelensky are that he is almost definitely going to stay in power now.
Quickly on Trump before we move on, obviously you talked about the kind of the two different elements there, Zach, the kind of like the Ukraine international response and then also the economic situation, which clearly is impacting independent voters. Which one of those do you think will long-term end up being more impactful? Do you think there is a risk here of America genuinely becoming a bit of a pariah and breaking from international norms and that impacting Trump?
For who? For Trump?
For Trump.
Okay.
Will that end up hurting Trump more, or are Americans more focused on the economic situation and therefore those issues could end up being more important?
It's a good question. My instinct is it's the economy. I think unless there was a really massive change in America's international standing, I think there will be a pretty big one, but unless it was something that was made so sort of damningly apparent that even sort of diehard Republicans, American First Republicans,
Europe
couldn't
kicks them out of NATO.
Yeah, whatever.
We kick them out.
Yeah, we don't even need you guys. Then I think that the economy, history suggests that the economy just is the dominant factor when it comes to how American electorates
Yeah.
vote. And I do think it was one of the things that strong points in Trump's first term. People did think he handled the economy pretty well. It was a pretty good economy, but also it was a strong point during the campaign. You know, a lot of the reasons that Trump did so well with sort of centrist independent voters is because they had more favorable recollections of Trump's economy than Biden's economy.
Yeah.
And if that reputation is trashed, I don't see how you can win an election on annexing Canada
Got
alone.
to bring down the price of eggs.
Price of eggs is really
It's
high.
crazy.
Really
we
high.
should be exporting eggs. Like, how is? I mean, I'm joking, obviously, because like
Someone did
but
sell
it's
them loads of
crazy
eggs.
how
One country
expensive-
sent like a couple. Turkey. Turkey sent America millions of eggs.
the
because
margin
they're
on
out of
their eggs, like they're charging like $20 a box.
They are. Are they actually trying to
$10, I think. But
Okay,
even
crazy.
still, even $10.
That's crazy.
We could get some eggs, pop on a flight, fill a bunch of seats with eggs, and we'd be absolutely quids in.
Why are we doing this?
Let's get some eggs. Okay, let's move on from that, because I think, obviously, as we've discussed, there's 4 movements on the board that are essentially related to similar situations. Obviously, the Trump economy thing slightly separate, but Trump obviously very much involved. And as has been the case ever since he entered the Oval Office, his decisions and his impacts is being felt kind of across the world and across the board. Let's move on to another person, though. Nadia, apologies for skipping over you in favor of Trump. Who is your loser of the week?
Yes. So my loser of the week is the Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis. I can't pronounce his first name very well. Essentially, what's happened over the weekend and on Friday in Greece and in Athens and across many big cities. In Greece, there's been mass protests marking the 2nd year anniversary of the Tempe train crash, which involved a passenger train, which led to the deaths of 57 people. Essentially, what's happened over the past 2 years is nothing. So there hasn't been any kind of trials. No one's been prosecuted. 82% of Greeks have said that this incident is the most important issues pressing Greece and Greeks right now. They called on a general strike, and there's essentially just a lot of frustration around the way the government has handled the entire investigation. When it first happened, there was a big lack of kind of organized, coordinated response from the government, and ever since then, there haven't been any further investigations. So really bad, like, state response. And now the left have basically stated that they're going to file a non-confidence vote against Mitsotakis and his government, which is basically just, the polling rates are really, really low. Mistrust is really high. So just not great for Mitsotakis and his government.
The second time we've had someone move on the board based on a train-related controversy, right?
And
which country was it that had like a station collapse or something?
Serbia.
Yeah. Keep an eye on your rail infrastructure, guys.
Yeah, well,
This
that's the
is
thing.
brutal.
The Greek railway infrastructure is just like a shambles. It hasn't been renovated in years and years and years. And Mitsotakis said after kind of the protests, we're going to make sure we're reforming the sector and try and modernize everything. But
I was on a Greek train last year, substandard, I'd say.
Yeah,
I'd be protesting.
I'd be scared to go.
One thing I want to say that there's also been some rumors that there was an illegal explosive substance on the freight train, because the very preliminary investigations, which by the way were done after there was what looked like a bit of a cover up.
Yeah.
So the authorities arrived on the scene and everything was immediately cleared up very, very quickly, and everyone was like, that's pretty dodgy. Yeah, as we say, not normally the most efficient authorities around. And then the preliminary investigations found that they thought a couple of people. So and another thing, by the way, is there's all students who died. Most of the people who died were students. A couple of people who died were actually died in an explosion as opposed to on impact, like were essentially burnt up, which is horrible. But and there has been some sort of accusations and some suspicions. That's because the freight train was carrying illegal substances. It's not entirely clear what it actually was carrying.
Wow.
I think it's because we hear about these stories and we think like, how could a guy be kicked out of office over a train crash that happened 2 years ago? But it is because there is a lot of like mystery and intrigue and suspicion surrounding this.
It speaks to, I think, a larger story of like criminality within governments, corruption, And yeah, it's been speculated that the freight train was like doing some kind of oil smuggling, and that was like the explosive.
There is an analogy with Serbia there, isn't there?
Of course. I mean, it's just it's the government's just being naughty, not naughty.
Yeah.
Symptom of corruption or criminality that's just deep rooted, and it's
This feels like a Nebula original series we should be tapping, like a true crime train documentary. They love that, the Nebula nerds. They love trains.
We'd struggle to get an interview with Vucic or Mitsotakis.
Yeah, maybe. Very interesting, though. And I think it'll be interesting to track Mitsotakis. He is obviously entering the board this week, entering in the lightly bad section. As you say, interesting this specific situation, but also a country we don't pay that much attention to. The TLDR, to be fair.
No.
I think very few, if any, Greek videos have been made across the history of the company. So having him on the board might encourage us to keep a closer eye on. And I think it'll be interesting to see his movements in weeks ahead. Speaking of which, we have the opportunity for a couple last movements in the biggest winner and biggest loser of the week. Okay, so as has happened the last couple of weeks, we are all now going to vote for our biggest winner of the week. We're each going to write it down, reveal it, and if there is unanimity, if all four of us are in agreement, then the person moves up an additional place on the board following their movement in today's episode. If there's not unanimity, they can still be declared the biggest winner, but they will not move. We need a clean sweep. So your options for biggest winner of the week are Keir Starmer, Vladimir Putin, and Al-Sharaa. Cast your votes now. Okay, Zach, who is your ultimate winner of the week?
It feels a bit provincial, and I was torn between him and Vlad, but Keir Starmer.
Okay.
Because he's had such a bad few weeks.
That's fair.
It's a proper U-turn.
You're allowing him to move all the way to the top of the board if we get unanimity here. Nadia, who is your winner of the week?
Come on, unanimity.
I've ruined the unanimity and gone for Vlad, but
Vlad!
Vlad, just Vlad.
Just Vlad.
yeah, Vladdy. So yeah, sorry.
Your best mate, Vlad.
Sorry.
Ben?
I've gone for Keir Starmer, same reasons. Tough few weeks.
Yeah.
Had a big old win last week. Got to give him it.
I also went with Putin. I think considering he's been the focus of the episode, he is winning across the board. I think, yeah, I agree in contrast to previous weeks.
Yes.
Starmer certainly, though I think you could also vaguely make the same argument for Putin versus the last couple of weeks because, I mean, obviously you had some
Yeah, but Putin didn't do anything.
I know he didn't do anything, but like even on Thursday, it looked like that Starmer was influencing like Trump to be more favorable to Zelensky, and then it's immediately flipped so hard the other way.
It's an ever so slight flaw in the plan, I'll accept, but I'm sticking with Starmer.
Okay.
Bigger winner.
Let's now do so that means there is no decision made at all.
Sorry.
Loser of the week.
It's 50-50. That's
Yeah, it's on everyone. So your options for loser of the week are Zelensky, Trump, and Mitsotakis. Part of this is a mind game of like, I think we're all trying to achieve unanimity to some extent because it'll be fun, but like it's partly a mind game of like, who are you going for now? Zach, who is your ultimate loser of the week? Sorry.
There are a lot of caveats, but I think losing the American sport just means Zelensky. I think that is just a massive loss. You can see it in the reaction of Zelensky's aides at the Oval Office meeting.
Nadia?
I'm going for Trump because I think it's obvious he wants to come into office, get a really quick political win, end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Not been able to do so, and he's just made a bit of a fool out himself. So he's my biggest loser of the week. And Zelensky still's got his stars Europe. So
that is very true. And the economic arguments Zach made too, to be fair. Ben?
I'm going Zelensky as well. Same caveats as Zach, but losing American sport is huge. And yeah.
I agree. Zelensky. I wouldn't have wanted to be in that room. It looked pretty rough. Okay, so Zelensky is our ultimate loser of the week, but we didn't achieve unanimity, which is obviously a perfectly valid result. No reason to be sorry, Nadia. Which means that Zelensky stays where he is. He's staying in the lightly negative part of the board, but is our ultimate loser of the week. Join us again next week, where we'll be running down another 6 people and explaining to you why they are the winners and losers of the week ahead. Also, make sure to comment who you think you should be moved or added to the board, and the top comment will be the one that does so next week. We will see you then.
Lovely, lovely.